So in today's video, we're going to be discussing how to start the golf swing with your driver. It's a question I get a lot. I recently on social media had a question of, is it the lead arm pushing or is it the trail arm pulling to start my golf swing? And if I was going to focus on one of those two, it would be the lead arm pushing the club away rather than the trail hand pulling. So a trail hand pulling motion, my issue would be, or the arm pulling movement, would be that the club head would almost stay where it was. We'd perhaps end up with a bit of a funky wrist angle there. So if there is going to be a sensation of arm, I would say it is the lead arm pushing the club away. However, my focus point has always been on what the body is doing and really focusing on my chest, my torso. So the key parts that I like to see in that first movement is some connection of my lead arm, so my tricep, the back of my arm here, across my chest, across my pec in that first movement. Now I'm not pulling my hands in because you can see what that's doing to my elbows. I'm getting this lead arm to run across the chest and my hands are gradually working on an inside arc. So they're moving on a slight arc and they're doing that because my body is starting to rotate. So there is some chest or torso rotation as this lead arm works across the chest and my hands and club work on a slightly inside arc. What do we see with the most common fault in that first movement? The club being whipped inside behind the player too much, and often the club face gets open. Now, why does the golfer get that? Well, it might be this movement with the arms, but it tends to be too much wrist hinge in that first movement. So think of the hinging movement being the door opening, door closing. I don't really want a whole lot of that in our takeaway movement. What do I want to start to see? More wrist cock. So that is the thumbs starting to point more up towards the sky. When does that happen? Well, it's a little later with a driver than an iron. So good drivers of the ball tend to have a slightly wider first movement before the wrists start to cock up. Whereas with an iron in their hand, so if I grabbed a 7-iron, shorter shaft, tilted over perhaps a little bit more in posture, and I am hitting down on this ball rather than up, we'd expect to see the wrist starting to cock up a little sooner with an iron compared to a driver movement. But the other takeaway parts there are very much the same whether we're talking about an iron or a driver. So let's get back into what I do want to see. Chest or torso rotation, lead arm connection across the chest, very passive with the hands in that first movement. And when I'm passive with my hands, not rolling forearms or hinging wrists, you will see that puts the club slightly outside my hands, which is where I'd really like to see it. As I said, one of the most common faults coaches see day in, day out is that club being pulled too much to the inside behind the player and often resulting in that club face getting very open. So what I'd like to see in terms of a club face position is the leading edge of the club pretty well matching my spine angle in that first takeaway move where the club is parallel to the ground. I don't mind seeing it a little bit more open than that, but I wouldn't want to start to see the club face pointing more up towards the sky. So very passive with the hands while I rotate my chest and my lead arm works across my chest. At this part of the golf swing with the driver is when the wrists start to cock up. And my sensation, my movement really here is almost that the handle starts to point a little bit more down. And you can see the effect that has. It starts getting that club working a little bit more up towards the sky. Now, as I'm making this movement, I'm still keeping that lead wrist nice and flat. So I'm really focusing on the first takeaway move, but I know the question I'll get will be, well, what do I do from there? How do I get it to that halfway back position? So the first movement, torso rotation, lead arm connection, very passive with the wrists. To get it to halfway back, it's just really that my wrists start to set. So my wrists are starting to cock. And that's happening because the handle is moving, the feeling of the handle starting to point more down, and you can see that gets the club pointing more up. And a halfway back position, a great checkpoint always for you if I set up to a golf ball, would be could you get the end of the grip pointing somewhere on the ball to target line or pretty close to it. That's my first movement. The handle starts to point down, and you would see here that the end of the grip is pointing somewhere pretty close to the extended ball to target line. It might be a little bit closer to me than that, slightly on the inside, but you wouldn't see it excessively one way or the other in that first movement. Now, a lot of golfers struggle with that first movement. They struggle with the tightness and the tension. So as a real quick tip, and you may prefer this with a driver, you may want to feel like the club is slightly hovered in the air to help that first movement and helps take some of that tension out and make a slightly freer, smoother first movement. But I'm feeling very soft with my hands. My focus point is the torso rotation, lead arm connection, and as I said, very passive with the wrist. Now, there's nothing stopping you when you're practicing iron or driver, make that movement, and I'm going to hit from the takeaway. Check, turn back to the ball, turn and hit. Now, I'd say that's going to be your range drill, but when you're working on a takeaway move, doing some, as I said, where you statically stop at that position, turn and hit could really help you. Let me see if I can. I was quite happy with that one, actually. Let me see if I can hit one more. And if you are working on your takeaway in the golf swing, what I'd always suggest is before you hit the shot, why not rehearse this movement once or twice? So I'd look at the golf ball. I don't want to watch the club going back. I want to focus on the golf ball. Lead arm connection as my chest rotates, very passive with the wrists. Check. Eyes back to the ball, club back to the ball, swing. So it's a pre-swing rehearsal. You'll see a lot of tour players do this. So let's run through it. Check, back to the ball, swing. If you can start that golf swing correctly, it influences so many other parts of the golf swing, and it's really going to help you make a more fluid golf swing and ultimately play some better golf on the course.